Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How important is democracy to billions of people around the world? What role can democratic institutions play in promoting economic, social, and cultural development of societies and countries? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're looking at democracy and how important it is for literally billions of people around the world who live in democratic countries and have democratic institutions. My guest today heads up the UN Democracy Fund and is an expert on this issue. My guest today is Dr. Roland Rich. Dr. Rich is the Executive Director of the United Nations Democracy Fund. Dr. Rich has over 35 years experience as a diplomat, scholar, and a democracy promotion practitioner. Dr. Rich, in 2005, was a research fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy in Washington, D.C. Roland Rich, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Great to be back, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's talk about democracy and the UN Democracy Fund. When was it started? Why was it started? What's your main mission?
Yeah. Well, it was started in 2005, established by the United Nations General Assembly in the World Outcome Summit, where quite a few institutions were created, including the Peacebuilding Commission, was another created in the same document. And our aim has been to strengthen the voice of civil society and to allow people to participate in democratic processes. Now, we've actually just passed a couple of really important milestones. We've now received more than $150 million in voluntary contributions from member states of the United Nations, and we've recently funded our 500th project since we've started. So these are milestones to prove we're really getting things done, and there's a lot of action at the UN Democracy Fund.
That's wonderful. Now, how do you do this? Do you have grants? Do you have a grant application process? Groups or whatever can apply for this funding?
We do have an application process. It's actually open right now. It's open from mid-November till the end of December. Each year we get about 3,000 applications. And we treat them all very respectfully. They're all given a score by outside assessors. And ultimately we consult our colleagues and we look for the best concepts. And the key point here, Bill, is that this is a demand-driven process. We don't design these projects. They're designed by civil society organizations out there. They have to win our trust and our acceptance.
Right. Now, you have a book here. Is this a product of one of your grants? If it is, or even it isn't, could you show it to us?
It is, Bill. It's an interesting concept. This was a project by a group called Poster for Tomorrow, and they called it Draw Me Democracy. And it was training young people in how to make posters. In 8 or 9 different countries around the world. And here are some good ones. I mean, this is so obvious. It's destination democracy and target voting. We have, and they're both from Bosnia and Herzegovina. This one is from Bolivia. It's an interesting little piece saying you've got to think as well as voting. Voting's not enough. Let's use the brain as well as the fingerprint. And on the other side, from Botswana, basically saying, don't take away my right to vote. Don't zip up the ballot box. So as you can see, I mean, a poster has to give you the answer immediately. This one from Ecuador is basically saying democracy has to be about equality. So everybody has to be able to participate in democracy. And I like the last one because it's about voice. That voting is a form of voice for civil society, and you can see the mouth forms the O. So these were about 100 posters, and then we exhibited them at the UN in Geneva. And so it was a wonderful project. I was very proud of it.
And they all signify democracy. That last one with voice, I think when we think about democracy, we think about having a voice,
Yes.
setting the agenda, having a say in your future and what's going on at the present time. You know, this, I don't want to get too far into it. You've written a book, and there are probably lots more out there about democracy, but how do you define democracy? There are different types. If you live in the U.S. or Canada or maybe in Bolivia or wherever it might be, there are different types of democracies, are there not?
Well, I think the best way to look at it, it is a big topic, Bill, and one could spend a lot of time on it, but I think the best way to think about it is that democracy is a process, and that process has many moving parts. And some of those parts are the supply of institutions, others might be rule of law aspects, others might be oversight bodies, but clearly participation by people, by electors, by civil society is a key part of that process. And I like the idea of the process as well because it's also telling us it's a destination. We go through this process. We're always aiming to improve the quality of our democracy. Even the most well-established democracy still has to work on quality issues.
It certainly does, yes. It's an ongoing process. You just can't do it for 1 week or 1 year and then quit, because that will be the end of it in all probability. Now, there's another project that came out, or a book that was written, the 2013 State of Participatory Democracy. And as I understand, that was one of your grantees, the Hunger Foundation.
The Hunger Project.
The Hunger Project. What exactly is the thrust of that?
Well, you know, it's an interesting concept, and we certainly like this project because it's dealing with a phenomenon that we're seeing all around the world, and that is, we can call it devolution in some countries, we can call it decentralization in other countries. The Europeans call it, a difficult word, subsidiarity, and that concept is take decisions at the lowest level possible, where they are competent to take those decisions. So we're seeing that process, and this project is about mapping and measuring participation in local governance. And here's the problem, Bill. In many countries, especially in the global south, civil society might be active in the capital, but is it active out there in the provinces? Is it active in the smaller towns and the other places? And we need to measure that and see whether that's a problem, and then try to address that problem.
And our viewers can go to un.org/democracy fund to get much more information about what we're talking about today. And it's a very interesting website, and you've got the book up there.
The book's online. Yep.
Oh, it's online.
Yep.
Better yet. So they can go to un.org/democracy fund. Well, as I recall, having read the UN Charter several times, I don't remember democracy ever being mentioned in the Charter. Now, there were institutions within the UN, the organs and what have you, set up on somewhat of a democratic basis. But today, correct me if I'm wrong on that first, but today the UN is really promoting democratic institutions and people to have a voice.
Yeah. You're quite right, Bill. The word democracy does not appear in the Charter. It appears in other documents written at that time. The UNESCO Charter has it, the OAS Charter has it, the Statute of Europe has it, but it does not appear in the Charter, and let's call it a spade a spade. The reason it doesn't appear, the Soviet Union would not allow it to be written into the Charter of the UN when the Charter was drafted. But what we've really discovered, especially since the end of the Cold War, is that the three pillars of the UN, peace, development and human rights, cannot be delivered without democracy. That democracy is a key ingredient in delivering the key pillars of the UN's mission. And so all the UN actors, whether they're working in health or education or peace building, all have a democracy element now in their brief, because that's the means of achieving the other goals.
That's very, very important. Of course, when you mentioned the former Soviet Union, that was back during the heyday of the Cold War. Oh, yeah. I guess 1945, the beginning of the Cold War, so to speak. And then we really got into it in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. Yeah. But the UN has changed quite dramatically over the past 68 years, and obviously any institution would, and it's certainly being much more active and proactive, and especially in this particular area in democracy. Now, you wrote a book in 2004, I guess it was, the UN role in promoting democracy. Yes. You talked about the comparative advantage of the United Nations as an institution in promoting democratic institutions. What is that comparative advantage?
You know, the comparative advantage is that the UN, to put it in modern parlance, has a great brand. People like the UN brand around the world. It has a reputation for impartiality. It carries with it global norms. It carries with it the ideals of the people of the world. So all these things give the UN a comparative advantage over, say, a national democracy institution or a political party democracy institution, which obviously has to carry some of the baggage of its country or party. But the UN is above all that. And I'll give you an example. Recently I was in Thailand, and we're funding a Muslim group in the deep south of Thailand. And one of the problems they said to me is that where they live, they're forced to choose between the military and the rebels. And I said to them, we are lending you the UN brand, and that means you can say you're impartial. That's the value of the UN brand in these situations.
And when we're talking about democracy, now there are 193 countries in the United Nations General Assembly. Basically, every country in the world is a member of the UN, more or less. A couple that are not would like to be, perhaps. But when you look at those 193 countries, some of them are very democratic, some of them are partially democratic, some of them are not democratic at all. And it seems that you're dealing with the issue of democracy, talking about democratic institutions that would be culturally sensitive, I would think, politically sensitive at times. You're talking about you choose between the rebels or the military. You have no choice in between, but they do have a third choice. How do you deal with that? Do you do cultural sensitivity, democratic training with your grantees, or how do you work on that?
Well, firstly, of course, we're not there to provoke governments or to create problems and so forth. That's not what we want to do. We want to strengthen the voice of civil society. Usually, most countries, whether they practice democracy or not, usually have a rhetoric in their constitution and in their rules that seem to allow for voice to be expressed. And we try to work within that rhetoric. But let me say this, Bill. Democracy is a universal value. Everybody sees it as a good thing. Some don't think it'll work in their countries, but everybody sees it as a universal value. And I think we're now moving from a universal value to a universal norm, that it should be able to work everywhere. And so we can't accept cultural relativism, that democracy is good for those people but not for us. No, it's good for everybody. Maybe it'll take longer to get there. So we've got to be patient on that.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're looking at the UN Democracy Fund and the role of developing democratic institutions around the world. My guest is an expert in this area. My guest today is Dr. Roland Rich. Dr. Rich is the Executive Director of the United Nations Democracy Fund. Roland, we've been talking about democracy and how it was not in the original charter, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and some of the other documents later alluded to it, but today it certainly is. But you have, as I understand, there's a democracy caucus at the United Nations. How did that get developed, and what exactly does the democracy caucus do?
Okay, well, that's a creature of an institution known as the Community of Democracies, which was established in the year 2000 as one of the final sort of acts of the Clinton administration at a major conference in Warsaw. Over 100 countries are members of the Community of Democracies, and one of the activities they do is meet at the UN as a caucus, or just as a group of like-minded countries to discuss various issues. Now, you know, an institution, a new institution, for the first 10 years, it simply has to survive. And the Community of Democracies held its meetings and, you know, attracted new members and survived. After 10 years, it has to start to deliver. We need to see some added value coming from this organization. And under the recent Mongolian chairmanship of the Community of Democracies, they focused very much on education for democracy. And in fact, we funded a group based in Washington, the Council for the Community of Democracies, that helped the Mongolians very much with that process, and a lot of terrific products and concepts came out of that process. El Salvador is now the chair of the Community of Democracies, and they want to concentrate on the link between democracy and development. another very important issue. So I think what we're seeing from the community of democracies is they're now trying to really produce things and add value on the subject of democracy.
And if our viewers would like more information on that, they can go to un.org/democracy fund.
Yes, and of course the ever useful Google will give them lots of
That's
stuff.
right. Just put in democracy at the United Nations and you got it. It's a very efficient way to do it. Well, that's very important. And again, this is a topic that we don't hear as much about as we should. And there are proponents out there and people who want to move this forward. You were talking about the community of democracies that we were referencing a few moments ago. And I know in the past, some people have said, and this is a very important group, but it's not the United Nations. The United Nations is set up to deal with war and peace, to deal with economic and social development, and to deal with human rights. And I know I've heard politicians in the United States and perhaps elsewhere talk about how the community of democracies could take over the roles of the United Nations, which I have never subscribed to that. I don't think many people do, but it's a very important group. It could never preempt the UN.
You know, I've been to several of their meetings, Bill, and I've never heard that discussed. So, yes, I think some outside commentators might have that view, but it's not the view of the community of democracies itself or its major members.
Exactly. People who know both institutions would not suggest that. In all probability, that's very true. Well, you've had several people, very important people, very high-level people, obviously, with leaders of the various governments, non-governmental organizations involved. And recently you had Jeffrey Wright, who's an award-winning actor, and he was starred in Boardwalk Empire,
yes,
and was going to be in the sequel to The Hunger Games.
Yes.
What role did he play, and why did you get him involved in the Democracy Fund?
Well, he's a member of our board. We have an unusual board in that it has member states, NGOs, and prominent individuals. And Jeffrey's on our board because he's passionately interested in Sierra Leone. He has a foundation that works there. He's extremely expert on the subject, and when we told him that we do work in Sierra Leone, he got very interested in being involved in the work of the Democracy Fund. And one of the little things he's done for us is narrate the film about a project we're doing in Sierra Leone. It's a project by a group called Democracy Sierra Leone, and it helps newly elected women members of parliament to deal with their constituencies by holding town hall meetings and explaining to people that please don't expect your member of parliament to pay for your education bills and to pay for your hospital bills and so forth. They're there to make policy, not to give money directly to the electors. And this is a big lesson that needs to be learned in many countries around the world. And so the women parliamentarians are just thrilled that there is a group that sort of does that for them. And then we have and I've been to one, we have very interesting sort of discussion at these town hall meetings. I went to the parliament in Sierra Leone and I got this rather backhanded compliment. A lot of criticism of this project. Why? The men wanted the same thing for them. But, you know,
that's right. Equal time.
That's right. But we
yeah.
only had a certain amount for this grant, and so we're focusing on women members of parliament.
Exactly. And the situation in Sierra Leone, we remember the horrific civil war that
yes.
took place. I guess it was Ishmael Bea, who one of the child soldiers, and
yes.
written a very moving book about his life as
yes.
a child soldier. But the situation is calm and tranquil today.
You know, Bill, no country can get over that sort of trauma quickly. But you do get over it eventually. And Sierra Leone is, you know, when you go there, it has all the indices of normality. It's a busy place. Freetown's a very busy city, and lots of things are happening. But every now and then, the war just jumps back out at you when you see a gentleman with no hands, lost both hands to the rebels in the war, and so forth. Then you realize that it's not that long ago that it happened. But I think the fact that they went through this catastrophic war is pushing everybody to try to make their democracy work. They have no alternative.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. Remember the horrific days of the Civil War, and very few people would want to return to that, I'm sure. Well, it's often been said, and you hear politicians and governmental leaders and college professors and a variety of folks say that democracies do not go to war with one another. Is that true? Do you find that if you're a democratic country, that in all probability you will not go to war against another democratic country?
Yeah. Well, the theory actually comes from the 19th century. It was Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, who first theorized that democracies wouldn't fight each other. And then an American academic, Rummels, his name was, actually then did a chart of warring pairs. All the countries that have fought wars against each other for the last 300 years. Mm-hmm. And to everybody's surprise, one of the results was that no consolidated democracy had ever gone to war against another consolidated democracy. Mm. And, you know, in social science, it's very rare to get a zero return. Usually you get a trend type return, more, you know, likelihood and probabilities. Mm-hmm. But here we had no democratic country went to war against another consolidated democratic country. Mm-hmm. So that really gave the social science community something to grasp onto. And the chairman of our board, Michael Doyle, is one of the great world experts on this issue. He's at Columbia. Now, having said that, his colleague at Columbia, Jack Snyder, and another colleague, Mansfield, wrote a different paper that said, yes, okay, that may be true, but transition democracies, that is those transitioning from authoritarianism or communism towards democracy, are very warlike and seem to go to war more often in various situations. And so, you know, that creates a dilemma. We have this goal that one day, if the world is full of consolidated democracies, we will get peace. Mm-hmm. But to get to that process, we go through some rather difficult times. Mm-hmm.
So when we say consolidated democracy, we're talking one that has a long track record of decades and decades of being having democratic institutions, changing elected officials peacefully and that type of thing?
So in the academic community, there are two definitions going around. Good old Sam Huntington had
remember
one,
him. Yes.
And I think his is no longer really accepted, and that is two transitions of power proves you're consolidated. Now, there's lots of examples where we see more than two transitions, in fact, and the country's not consolidated. Two other academics, again, one from Columbia, Stepan and Lintz, have made a far more compelling argument. Democracy is consolidated when there is no other game in town. That is, when no serious political player wants any other system. Every serious political player accepts the rules of the game, plays by the rules of the game because they accept the concept, the structure around them. That's when you have a consolidated democracy.
Mm-hmm. Well, Roland, as you worked with this program for many years, you're an expert in the whole concept of democracy. What do you see as some of the major challenges in the future? I know money is always a challenge, obviously. You just got $150 million or something like that, which is wonderful.
Cumulatively.
Cumulatively,
yes,
right.
Yes.
But what are some of the challenges as you try to reach out to minorities, as you reach out to women, as you reach out to the disadvantaged, you reach out to people who are powerless in many respects, who have had no voice in their society? What do you see as some of the challenges as far as bringing them into the system and helping them to develop into perhaps future leaders, or at least have some say in their future?
Well, we certainly fund those sorts of projects. We have many projects aimed at indigenous people, one for Maasai women, one for Inuit people from Russia, one for indigenous people from Guatemala. We have many projects like that. We have other projects that support the right to information, which is a critical step for civil society. We're trying to work very hard on youth projects, and we've had several youth parliaments around the world, one in Pakistan, one in Lebanon, I think one in Tajikistan as well. We're trying to fund other types of projects. We funded one to develop think tanks so that we have better policy alternatives coming in these transition countries. We've tried to do some edgy things like street theatre projects in Nicaragua and Jordan and so forth. Why? Because I think you're dead right, Bill. The challenge for democracy is exclusion. We're seeing this economically. That is the Gini coefficient that measures inequality, economic inequality in a society, is going in the wrong direction in just about every country in the world, very few exceptions, this country included. Is simply we're seeing more inequality, not less. And the answer to inequality is to give those people at the bottom of the pyramid more voice. So they can demand things, they vote, they should vote and they should demand from their politicians better policies that help them. So that's really what we need to do, and I think that's the challenge for democracy around the world. It needs to really include more people, listen to them, and allow civil society to act very freely in the world. And that's another challenge.
Exactly. And this is such an important concept. And of course, our viewers can go to www.un.org/democracy fund. And we all need to learn much more about democracy. And as you mentioned, not just vote, but to learn the issues, to learn the candidates, and to be actively involved in the process, because anyone can go in and just pull a lever or stick their finger in a certain color of ink or something like that. But it's very, very important that we do this and that we involve people, as many as possible, and not exclude people. But Dr. Roland Rich, Executive Director of the UN Democracy Fund, I want to thank you so much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill. My pleasure.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.